morning. Greet all of you in Christ's name. It's good to be here again this morning. It's good to see Andy's are back. He mentioned in Sunday school it's good to see us, and I think we'd all agree it's good to see them again as well. This morning, just I'd like you to think about our country a little bit. I think, as most of you know, there's a lot of cultures within our country. You could say it's a bunch of countries within a country. Our country isn't just northern Indiana with a bunch of trailer factories and a bunch of Amish and Mennonites, and it's made up of a lot of different people. It's made up of rednecks. It's made up of Duck Dynasty. It's made up of swamp people. It's made up of uppity East Coast people who are impatient and rude to you. It's made up of inner city ghettos. There's politicians in D.C. There's people in L.A. There's particularly people in Hollywood that are just completely out of touch with the real world, at least in our opinion. But every culture is different, and there's a unique culture in all of those. I think we define culture as a pattern of human belief and behavior, or the customary beliefs and the social norms of a social group. And it's kind of a group of people that are living together by the same standards, same life patterns. Reed Wilson wrote a column in 2013 in the Washington Post, and he cited the existence of 11 separate nation states in the United States, where the dominant culture explains the voting behaviors and attitudes towards social issues and the role of government. In mapping the 11 nation states within the United States, they cited a distribution of linguistic dialects, prevalence of different religious denominations, and a county-by-county breakdown of voting in every hotly contested presidential race in our history. And among those 11 nation states they found, there's the left coast, the far west, the Midlands, El Norte, New France, Deep South, the Tidewater, the Greater Appalachia, the New Netherlands, and Yankeedom. All these regions reflect different cultures within our culture as a country. And I think similarly, there's two other cultures that I'd like to talk about today. There's the culture of darkness and the culture of light. And people that live in the culture of darkness have a certain set of habits and certain ways they live their lives, as do the people that live in a culture of light. They have different beliefs, different behaviors, different practices that are formed by the culture that they live in. So I'd like to continue in Ephesians 5. We're going to start in verse 8 this morning, verses 8 through 16. And if you remember where we left off last time, Paul had talked about things we put off and was challenging us to not let anyone deceive us and to live new lives as redeemed believers. Today in this section it talks about how we transform from darkness to light. So beginning to read in verse 8 of Ephesians chapter 5 through verse 16. For at one time you were in darkness, but now you are light in the world, in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true, and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed to the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, Awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. As we go back to maybe verses 3 through 7, it talks a lot about how we should live, how we should talk, and how we should. It's a lot about how we walk every day and how people see us, putting off obscene talk and crude joking and immorality, impurity, greed. Just put those things off and don't partake in any of those. Make sure that people see you're different. Don't partner with them. And I think we often, and rightly so, we take a list of the things that we're not supposed to do, and we decide that yes, the way we should live is by doing the opposite of things that we shouldn't do. But I think it still begs the question: why do people live in darkness? Why are there? We see people every day that are living in darkness, and they seem content there at times. I think there's several reasons for that. I think Ephesians 4, verse 17 through 19 talks about that. It says, Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. They have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. So there it implies that they've made some choices, they've become calloused, and they've just kind of let darkness reign in them. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4 says, in their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So I think, again, they've allowed themselves, just the God of this world, to blind themselves, and so they're happy to live in darkness. They enjoy that, which is hard for us to understand. There was, I think in the early 2000s, there was a social network started, which I've never heard of before until I was studying for this. It was called the Experience Project. And people went on there to share an experience they had. Some of the examples were given, like what it felt like to go through a divorce, what it felt like to have a family member pass away. And it's I believe it's shut down now, but I think as of May of 2016, the site had something like 67 million visitors who all shared an experience they had and talked about it. And in one post, readers were asked to respond to the statement, "I prefer darkness over light." And this is what one young woman wrote. She said, "I prefer darkness over light because the darkness allows me to hide who I am and how I feel. In the light, all things have a chance to be revealed. Darkness makes it easier
free from what you were and can be what you want. The darkness is bliss."
That's horrifying, isn't it? Just the idea that they loved darkness because she loved it because she could hide and she could be her true self without anyone, her true self, without anyone judging who she was. I don't think it'd be a stretch to say that she was probably involved in some fairly serious sin because she wanted to hide and she wanted to make sure that no one could see that. Bliss is not how this passage describes darkness. It describes it as something that we should get away from and come away from. It talks about shameful sins in verses 3 through 5. It talks about the sexual immorality, impurity, or greed. It talks how we should get away from those. It talks about unfitting talk, obscene stories, foolish talk, and coarse jokes. And then in verse 6 of this passage, it talks about excusing sin and being fooled by people who try to excuse it and try to make it sound like it's okay. G.K. Chesterton once remarked, "Men do not differ much about what things they will call evil. They differ enormously about what evils they will call excusable." I think that's very true. It's just so often we know it's wrong. I think all of us can agree on some things that are wrong, but especially when people's minds start to become darkened, there's just all sorts of reasons for, I did that, but it's because of, and they did this to me, and so now this is who I am. And so it's excusable, right? It's just kind of, it is what it is. And there's these different levels of what we think is excusable and what isn't. There's often a question about whether fear or punishment, whether fear of punishment or hope of reward is more effective in influencing human behavior. Especially if you're raising children, that's something that I think all of us as parents experiment with. We experience with punishment or reward. There's actually a study done on this at the University of Oregon. And they answer the question in distinctly theological terms. The gentleman who ran the lab said, "The key finding is that a nation's rate of belief in hell predicts lower crime rates, but the nation's rate of belief in heaven predicts higher crime rates." At this stage, we can only speculate about the mechanisms, but it's possible that people who don't believe in the possibility of punishment in the afterlife feel like they can get away with unethical behavior. There's less of a divine deterrent. See, I think our thoughts about heaven and hell matter today. They matter because of how it influences how we live. He goes on to say the key finding is that a belief in hell predicts lower crime rates, but the belief in heaven predicts higher crime rates. It would seem that if those living in darkness knew about the outcomes of their choices, it would make a difference. So this morning, I think one of the things we're going to look at is what are we doing as we walk in light to make sure that people understand the outcome of their choices. Because the truth of the matter is, if you're living in darkness this morning, whether you know it or you're living there ignorantly, the outcome is going to be hell. It's not a fate that we wish on anyone, but it is a result of living in darkness. You know, you've often heard that sin will take you further than you want to go. It will keep you longer than you want to stay and will cost more than you're willing to pay. The second culture that we want to talk about this morning is the culture of light. Ephesians 5, verse 8 to 10 that we read this morning, it says, "For at one time you were in darkness, but now you are in light in the Lord. Walk as children of light." So we're supposed to walk differently now because we've come out of the darkness and now we're coming into the light. And so be different. Make sure that your lives are different. "For the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them." I think sometimes we read that passage and we decide, well, now that I'm walking in light, what's important for me to do is to stay as far away from darkness as I can. So if those people are sinners, let's make sure we don't have anything to do with them. Let's get together with the church and make sure that we're in this culture of light and there's no darkness among us. In some cases, that's true. I think it's very important that we have the church and that we're with people, fellow believers that can help us on our walks. But it's also impossible to be salt and light to the world, right, if we're just hiding the light in one corner and we're not refusing to go out to the people who desperately need to see the light. And I think the one thing that we need to remember is that in every relationship, we're either being influenced or we are the influencer. And so it's important that we keep that in mind as we think about living in light. Jesus was talking in John 17, 14 through 18. He says, "I've given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world, and for their sake I consecrate myself, that I might also be sanctified in truth." So there, Jesus is sending us out into the world to make sure that we are shining our light for him. And I think there's a story of Benjamin Franklin who wanted to get the city of Philadelphia interested in lighting, in street lighting. And his approach was very unique. Instead of calling a city meeting and trying to just pound into people how nice it would be if we had lights, we desperately need lights. It would reduce crime. You could see at night, and things would just be so much better. Instead, he did something different. He just acted on his good idea. He went out in front of his house. He took a lantern and made sure it was really bright, cleaned it, and hung his light there. And people commented as they walked by, "Oh, it's really nice. I can see where I'm walking." And so he just kept that light burning and made sure it was cleaned every night, made sure there was plenty of oil in it, and just kept it out there. So what happened as a result? Soon a couple of his neighbors had a light out. And kind of as word spread, more and more people just took interest in the fact and that they needed lights, and the whole city saw they needed street lights. And so Philadelphia put in street lights. I think that's the way our lives are supposed to be. As we're shining that light, as people see that, hey, you know what? There's something different there. They have peace. They're not angry all the time. What can I do to be like that? That's what we're called to do. So let's let our lights shine. Let's not just hide it under a bushel. Let's make sure people can see it. We talked a little bit about our sphere of influence, but who do you hang out with? Who are you with? Who are you influencing? Who's influencing you? I think it's important that even as we are in the world, that we don't become partners with people and things of the world that are wrong. 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 through 16 talk about that. It says, "And God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh." And in verse 7 of chapter 5 that we're studying today in Ephesians, it says, "Therefore," after he lists all those things that he didn't want them to engage in, he says, "Therefore, do not become partners with them." But the influence we have on each other and the people we meet is tremendous. I think it's something that we sometimes forget how powerful it is and how much we can be influenced by other people. One of the strange sights on the Dutch Windward Islands in the Caribbean is the divvy tree. Because the winds blow almost constantly from the east, all the branches grow on one side of the tree. And you can look at a tree and you can always know which way is east and which is west. But what's interesting about that is that didn't just happen in a day, did it? It didn't just happen in a week. It didn't just happen in a month. It's happened over time, right? Because that wind has always been there. It's always been blowing as those trees grow. It shapes them. Same thing applies to our lives. Just because you're with people and you think, man, I've been shining my light, I've been doing all these right things, and they're still just this grouchy, angry person that I don't want to be with. That just because it's been a day, it's been a year, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen overnight. But I think we need to continue to influence and continue to let our light shine. It's not going to happen overnight. The other thing is, I don't think I've ever heard a testimony of someone whose life has been radically changed, where they didn't, at some point, talk about some person that God used to help change them and to help transform their life. God always uses people, typically, to help change and transform people's lives. It's important that we're willing to be those people, to be willing to stand up and to let our light shine so that we can influence those around us. It's also important that we are influenced, that we have people that are speaking into our lives. I think if we can get those two things right, it will go a long way in our walk. If we are influencing people for Christ and that we're also having people influencing us. I think a second sphere that we can look at is our sphere of activity. What do you do? Verse 9 talks about producing only what is good and right and true. Paul in chapter 4 had also talked about the actions of those who live in light. In verse 25, he talks about don't lie, but tell the truth. Kind of a series of contrasts here that he uses. Don't be angry, but reconcile. Don't steal, but do hard work so you can help others. Don't use foul language, but say what is good and helpful and encouraging, in verse 29. Don't be bitter or angry or speak harsh words, but be kind, tenderhearted, and forgiving. What we do is a big part of letting our light shine, because people see those things. They see our actions, they hear our words, they sense our attitudes. The third one then is the sphere of decision making, carefully determining what pleases the Lord, which talks about in verse 10. It also talks about in verse 17. It says, therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. I think the idea is to make sure that the things I'm doing are, the decisions I'm making are honor God, and that they please Him, and it's not that I'm just doing what Scott wants and what makes Scott happy today, but that I'm actually putting it to the test and taking it, bringing it before the Lord. I think God doesn't always show us the entire path, but He does show us the next step. I found God to always be very faithful in showing me what the next right thing is. He may not show me 5 years from now, which there's times where I've really wanted that, but He has always shown me what the next step is, and we just need to walk in that and faithfully follow Him. Going on to think a little bit more about light living in darkness. Verses 10 through 14 talk a lot about not taking part in worthless deeds of evil and darkness, but instead exposing them. Basically, shining a light on, just letting our light shine exposes people's sin and makes things visible. I think that can often be, we don't have to tell an alcoholic that he shouldn't drink alcohol. He probably knows that already. We don't have to tell a drug addict to just stop. I think sometimes if we can simply talk to them about Jesus, talk to them about our lives, it makes more of an impact than saying, hey, you really should stop doing that. Because they know that. They know they shouldn't do that. They wish they could stop for the most part. But letting them see Jesus through us can be one of the most effective ways, because our light exposes them. You know, light has a tremendous influence on total darkness. There's some studies that show that a single candle can be seen from 1.5 miles to 2 miles away. When it's completely dark, the human eye can see that. And scientists say that has something to do with the curvature of the earth as well. But say if you're high enough, you can see a candle from a distance of 30 miles. So even the smallest flickering light in complete darkness can be seen. Obviously, I think that translates well to our lives as Christians. If we let our light shine, people will see it. They will see it in the darkness as we are living for God. I think the first way we can do that is by being an example. Verse 11 talks about take no part in the deeds of evil and darkness. And then verse 12 and 13 says, let your light do its work. Evil intentions will be exposed when the light shines on them. So as we let our light shine, all of a sudden those who want to live in darkness and find the bliss there that young lady was talking about, all of a sudden their evil is exposed and they see it for what it is. And then it transforms darkness into light. Verses 13 through 14 say, but when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. So let's let our lives be a positive transformation on the darkness that's around us. Shauna Pilot had just had enough of her husband. She had a 3-year-old boy, and once again, her husband hadn't come home all night. And she just had enough of worrying about his unfaithfulness and losing sleep, and she was just frustrated with life in general. And as she was washing dishes one Sunday morning, she heard someone speaking, a man speaking on the television. He invited the listening audience to join him for worship later in that morning. And just kind of out of her frustration and just being dissatisfied with her life, she decided, you know what, I'm going to go to church. So she got dressed, she went to church, and on the way there, all that she could think about was just getting emotionally strong enough to kick her husband out and tell him that she was done. But something happened at that church service. I'm not exactly sure what message was preached, but at the end of the service, she actually committed her life to Christ, and she was saved that morning. And life doesn't typically change this fast, but 3 weeks later, her husband asked if he could go to church with her. He saw the difference in her. He saw what his addictions were doing to their family. He knew that was hurting them. And 5 weeks later, he recognized his need for forgiveness, and he also became converted. Their lives changed. Their marriage changed. Their parenting changed. Their habits changed. And today, her husband says, if Christ can do it for me, he can do it for anyone. See, transformation is what happens when light exposes darkness and the darkness becomes light. People, if we think about changing someone's spiritual culture, people don't necessarily always resist change. They just resist being changed, right? They resist when we try to make them change. Because changing someone's heart and life means that their whole world has to change. They have to get rid of their old belief system. They have to get rid of their old behaviors. And they have to adopt new behaviors, new belief systems, just a completely new culture. This morning, I think God is at work in everyone's life here. All of you are in different steps in life's journey. God has been transforming all of us. We're in different places. And, God is working on bringing more light into all of our lives. He's working to take the corners of our hearts and make sure that there's not darkness hidden in them. And God is also using all of us to be light into the worlds that we go into. As I often think about, for us men especially, as we go to work, there's a lot of darkness in places where most of us work, and God is using us and giving us the opportunity to shine light where we work. For moms, it's as you're taking care of the children, or as you're going to the store, or there's a lot of opportunities for you as well as you engage in the public, and honestly, you probably spend a lot more time with the children than us as dads do. But there's opportunity for all of us to shine light into the world that we're in. And if we look at verses 15 and 16 there at the end of this passage, it says, look carefully then how you walk. And let's think about this as we think about being light, as we think about changing the culture around us, as we think about showing people that there's something better, there's something different. It says, look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. You know, as we think about looking carefully how we walk, it's because it's for our own good. First of all, it's to make sure that we keep that relationship intact with God. But it's also because people are watching us. People are watching all of us as we go about our business and as we go about our day. They see how we react to things. They see what we're doing. So be careful. Let's be careful how we walk. And then make the best use of the time because the days are evil. You know, it doesn't seem, if you read the news at all, and sometimes I think it's good to just take a break for a while because it just doesn't seem to be getting any more cheerful or encouraging as you look at the news. Definitely does seem like the days are evil, and the time is short. I think it's always been important, but I don't think it's ever been more important that we make good use of our time, that we make sure that we're shining our light wherever we go, because the days are short, the days are evil, and we don't know when time will end, but it's coming. And it would just really, I think all of us would regret if we chose to hide our light and we see friends and relatives not making the choice for Christ before the time is up. These thoughts, let's bow our heads for prayer. God, this morning as we've looked at letting our light shine in darkness and the impact and the influence we can have because we've been transformed, I just pray, God, that you would just help us to be faithful in that, help us never to be ashamed or to be embarrassed, but to very kindly and with your love, let our light shine so that people can see that there is something better, there's something different. There can be hope here as well as in eternity. Just thank you, God, for the work you've done in our lives, and just pray, God, that you would continue to be open to the continued transformation that you want to do in us as we grow to be more and more like you. Just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Phil, can we have a song at this time?